He stood in the quiet of his front porch, stunned, holding a marriage certificate he had never signed, never even seen. In that moment, everything he believed about his own life shattered, because someone had convinced a pastor to marry him in secret while he remained completely unaware. What silent betrayal could ruin a wedding before the vows were ever spoken? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The moment the pastor's trembling voice broke through the silence, the air in that church changed forever. "This wedding cannot continue." His words were not spoken lightly, nor were they part of some dramatic performance. He knew something no one else in that room dared to say aloud. As the groom stood frozen, staring at the woman he thought he knew, and as the bride clutched her bouquet with a grip that betrayed her fear, the questions began to spread like wildfire among the guests. Who exactly was this bride hiding from? What shadow of her past was now casting itself over what should have been the happiest day of her life? And why would a pastor, trusted to unite two souls in love, risk his reputation, his calling, and his very place in that community to stop a ceremony so sacred? The whispers grew louder, glances shot from pew to pew, and yet the answers remained locked in silence. For the truth was not just about a marriage, it was about deception, hidden records, and a story that had already begun long before the vows were even written. This wasn't simply a wedding tale. It was a tale of betrayal that would tear open the lives of everyone who believed they knew the bride. It was about lies woven so carefully that even those closest to her could not see them until it was far too late. And most of all, it was about justice, the kind of justice that does not come quietly, but arrives in the most public and devastating way possible, before God, before family, and before an entire town. Before that unforgettable day inside the church, there was a man named David. In his early 50s, David had spent his life working with his hands, a man shaped by labor, loyalty, and an unshakable belief in the sanctity of family. He was known in his town not for wealth or titles, but for his character. A dependable neighbor, a devoted father, and the kind of man who kept his promises even when it cost him. When David fell in love again, after years of carrying both joy and loss, people said he deserved happiness more than anyone. And when he met Angela, the woman who would stand across from him in that church, he believed he had found the missing piece to his life story. Angela was everything that drew people in at first glance: graceful, soft-spoken, with a charm that seemed effortless. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that suggested she had overcome struggles, though she rarely spoke about them. To friends and to David's family, she appeared elegant and caring, offering laughter at dinners, showing affection in quiet moments, and promising a kind of devotion David had long prayed for. Yet, behind those gestures, there were traces of shadows she never fully explained. She would excuse herself from the table when the phone rang, speaking in low tones in the kitchen, returning with a smile that felt slightly rehearsed. Letters would arrive at the house sealed with no return address, and she would fold them away in her purse without a word, claiming they were trivial, not worth discussing. And when neighbors occasionally whispered about people from Angela's past, she would brush it off, insisting the past had no place in her present. Then there was Pastor Mark, a man whose life was rooted in truth. In his late 50s, he was respected not just as a pastor, but as a guardian of integrity. For decades, he had officiated weddings, baptized children, and buried the dead, always with an unwavering commitment to honesty before ceremony. To Pastor Mark, marriage was not a formality, it was a sacred covenant, and he believed that standing before God meant standing with nothing to hide. People came to him because he spoke plainly, lived humbly, and never allowed tradition to outweigh truth. On the surface, these three lives, David, Angela, and Pastor Mark, were about to converge in celebration. Family dinners painted a picture of warmth, as David's grown children welcomed Angela with cautious optimism. Friends toasted their love at gatherings, recalling David's loyalty and Angela's new beginnings. Their vows of love were rehearsed in private moments, words heavy with hope and expectation. To the outside world, this was a union meant to heal wounds and mark a new chapter. But beneath the laughter, the smiles, and the polished appearance of normalcy, cracks were forming. Late-night calls, Angela would not explain. The way she turned away when certain names were mentioned. Her insistence that some parts of her past remain untouched, as if the truth were a locked door no one was permitted to open. David, blinded by love, chose to trust. Pastor Mark, however, began to notice details he could not ignore. Records that did not align, questions Angela avoided, and a sense that the truth had been buried under layers of charm. These moments, though subtle, foreshadowed the storm that was coming. A storm that would erupt, not in private, but in the most public and devastating way imaginable. For while David believed he was preparing for a lifetime of happiness, and Angela believed she could keep her secrets hidden, Pastor Mark knew that when the truth finally surfaced, it would not wait quietly in the shadows. It would come crashing into the sanctuary, tearing apart the very moment that was meant to unite them. The morning of the wedding began like any other in the small town, yet carried the kind of anticipation that seemed to settle over every guest who entered the church. The sanctuary was dressed in white roses, candles flickered gently, and the air was heavy with the sound of soft organ music. Friends and family filled the pews, their faces expectant, waiting for a love story to finally be sealed in sacred vows. David stood near the altar, his suit pressed, his eyes searching the aisle with the nervous joy of a man who believed his future was moments away. He had waited for this day, convinced that all the years of loneliness had been worth it. Angela, the bride, prepared in a side room, her gown flowing with elegance, her smile measured. Yet those closest to her noticed her hands trembling as she adjusted her veil, and though she forced laughter with her bridesmaids, her eyes often darted to the door as though she feared something or someone might enter uninvited. Pastor Mark walked slowly toward the altar, his Bible held firmly, his expression unreadable. He had officiated hundreds of weddings, yet on this day his steps seemed heavier, as though every movement carried the weight of a burden few could understand. When the music swelled, and Angela finally began her walk down the aisle, every head turned to witness the moment. Gasps of admiration filled the church, but beneath the beauty of the moment, there was unease. She moved gracefully, yet her eyes remained fixed forward, never daring to glance at those seated around her. David's eyes filled with emotion as he reached for her hand, and for a moment, the world seemed perfectly aligned. But when Pastor Mark cleared his throat and began the ceremony, something in his voice carried an edge that caught the attention of the congregation. His words were steady, but strained, as though each line was weighed against a truth pressing in on him. He began with scripture, with blessings, with the ritual phrases that marked every union. Yet as his gaze lingered on Angela, his tone shifted. Silence fell in the sanctuary, and his next words cut through the stillness like a blade. "This wedding cannot proceed." The declaration struck like lightning. David stood frozen, his hand slipping from Angela's. Her bouquet shook violently in her grasp, the color draining from her face until she appeared ghost-like beneath her veil. Guests gasped in disbelief, the whispers rushing through the pews like a wave crashing against stone. Family members leaned forward, their eyes wide, while others covered their mouths in shock. The organist stopped mid-note, and for a moment the only sound was the hushed chaos of people trying to understand what had just been said. David looked from Angela to Pastor Mark, confusion etched deep into his face, his lips parting to speak, but no words coming. Angela's eyes darted, as though searching for an escape, her body stiff, her voice caught in her throat. Pastor Mark stood firm, his Bible pressed against his chest, his voice unwavering now that the words had been spoken. He repeated them, each syllable louder, more final. "This wedding cannot proceed." The air turned heavy, as though the weight of truth itself had descended upon the room. Panic rippled through the guests, some rising to their feet, others demanding answers. Children cried, mothers whispered prayers, and still David stood paralyzed at the altar, unable to comprehend what was unraveling before him. And then, silence again. The kind of silence that follows shock, when hearts pound louder than voices. Pastor Mark lowered his head for a moment, before looking into the eyes of the groom and bride, and in that pause, the entire room leaned forward, waiting for the reason. The question hung over the church like a shadow no one could escape. What secret was so powerful, so damning, that it forced a man of faith to halt a sacred ceremony before the vows were spoken? What did Pastor Mark know that no one else dared to say aloud? In the wake of Pastor Mark's words, the church was swallowed by confusion. Guests who had come expecting joy were now whispering accusations, their voices sharp and urgent. David stood as though struck, staring at Angela with eyes that begged for an explanation, but none came. Angela's silence was louder than any denial, and Pastor Mark, with a steady hand and an even steadier voice, began to reveal the truth he could no longer contain. He explained that before the ceremony, while finalizing church records, he had discovered inconsistencies that led him to search further. What he uncovered was undeniable. Angela was still legally bound in another marriage. The documents he found bore her name, her signature, and the date that proved this union she now attempted was not only deceitful, but unlawful. To David's horror, the woman he believed would soon be his wife was already someone else's, her vows promised years earlier to another man. The congregation erupted into chaos. Some cried out in shock, others demanded answers, and still others defended Angela, insisting there must be some mistake. But Pastor Mark, known for his caution and his refusal to act without certainty, presented the evidence. The marriage certificate itself, a legal document hidden until now. He held it with trembling hands, not because he doubted its authenticity, but because he knew the devastation it carried. David's knees weakened as the realization settled into his chest. His children, seated near the front, looked at Angela with a mix of anger and disbelief, their faith in her shattered in an instant. And Angela, pale and rigid, struggled for words, her voice breaking as she claimed there had been misunderstandings, that papers were not what they seemed. Yet her eyes told another story, a story of concealment and fear. As the ceremony collapsed, the scandal spread beyond the church walls. By evening, whispers had become headlines, and soon the entire town was divided. Some believed Angela had been a victim of identity theft, her name and records twisted without her knowledge. Others believed it was all deliberate, that she had crafted a second life, concealing her past marriage while seeking to secure another. Questions multiplied. Who was the other man? Where was he now? Did he know she was attempting to wed again? The investigation revealed unsettling truths. The marriage certificate, once hidden, was no forgery. It was real, signed and filed years earlier. Angela had not been abandoned or tricked into a false union. She had entered willingly. Yet here she stood, ready to repeat vows she had already spoken. Some speculated she was running from that first husband, desperate to erase her past by creating a new one with David. Others believed money and security had driven her, that she saw in David the stability her other life lacked. Still others suspected something darker, that her deception was part of a pattern, one that extended far beyond these two men. Detectives began to trace Angela's past, uncovering fragments of a double life. Apartments rented under different names, bank accounts with unexplained transactions, letters from the man she had married before, letters that hinted at betrayal, at promises made and broken. Each discovery painted a portrait not of a woman trapped by circumstance, but of one who had chosen to live two lives at once. To some, Angela was a manipulator, weaving lies for her own gain. To others, she was a desperate woman haunted by mistakes, clinging to the hope of starting again. David, however, saw only betrayal. His trust, the foundation of his love, had crumbled. To know that Angela had stood before him, day after day, claiming honesty while hiding a truth so devastating, cut deeper than any wound. And yet, the full picture was still incomplete. For even as evidence piled up, there remained questions unanswered. Was Angela's deception truly calculated, or was she entangled in something far greater than herself? Was she a victim of circumstance, or an architect of lies? The scandal did more than divide a family. It fractured a community. Some argued that Pastor Mark had done the right thing, upholding truth over tradition no matter the cost. Others whispered that he had humiliated Angela unjustly, that secrets of this nature should have been handled behind closed doors. But one reality could not be ignored. The wedding had ended not with vows of love, but with the revelation of betrayal, and the lives of everyone involved would never be the same. And still, beneath the headlines and the outrage, one haunting question remained. What was Angela truly hiding? Because if this was only about a forgotten marriage certificate, why did her fear run so deep? Why did her silence seem to conceal more than one secret? And what part of her past had yet to be uncovered? As investigators dug deeper, it became clear that Angela's hidden marriage was only the beginning. What Pastor Mark had uncovered that day at the altar was merely the first crack in a much larger facade. Behind the paperwork, behind the promises she made to David, and even behind the vows she once spoke to another man, there was a trail of deceit stretching further than anyone could have imagined. Financial records began to surface, revealing transactions that raised questions no one could ignore. Accounts opened in Angela's name were tied to funds that did not belong to her. There were withdrawals made from places she never mentioned, and deposits linked to businesses that no one could trace. These were not the actions of someone simply trying to escape an unhappy marriage. They were signs of someone carefully weaving a life in shadows, where lies were currency and truth was left behind. David, who had once believed he knew every corner of Angela's heart, now stood on unsteady ground. The woman he had dreamed of calling his wife had not only concealed her first marriage, but seemed to have built her entire future with him upon a foundation of fraud. Family and friends who had come to the wedding with smiles and celebration now struggled with disbelief. Some muttered that Angela was driven by greed, seeking comfort and security at the expense of honesty. Others whispered that perhaps she had been forced into these choices by fear, escaping something far darker than money or convenience. Yet for David, every revelation was like another dagger, piercing what little hope he had left in the love he once cherished. The congregation, still reeling from the chaos inside the church, now faced a deeper betrayal. Those who defended Angela began to waver as evidence grew undeniable. Pastor Mark, though heartbroken to be the bearer of such devastating truth, stood unwavering in his conviction. He reminded everyone that marriage was not merely a tradition to be preserved at any cost, but a sacred vow built upon honesty. By exposing Angela's deception, he had protected not only David but also the sanctity of the vows she had so carelessly disregarded. Yet even as the truth emerged, emotions burned hotter than ever. Tears fell from David's eyes as he confronted the reality that the woman he had trusted was not the woman she had claimed to be. Angela's silence, her downcast eyes, her trembling hands, none of it could erase the mountain of evidence against her. And still, there remained a strange unease, as though what had been revealed was not the full story. The documents told of a past marriage, the accounts hinted at betrayal for financial gain, and her lies had shattered the very core of trust within the community. But beneath it all, there was a sense that Angela's actions were not only about wealth or comfort. Her choices carried the shadow of desperation, as if she had been running, not just from her husband, not just from her truth, but from something darker that no one yet understood. The emotional climax came when David, unable to contain his anguish, broke down before those who had gathered. His strong frame trembled as he covered his face, his sobs echoing in the quiet that had fallen over the church. This was not just the cry of a man betrayed, but of someone watching the future he had built in his heart collapse before him. Friends rushed to his side, while others turned on Angela with sharp words and accusations. The once joyous congregation now stood divided, torn between anger, pity, and confusion. Pastor Mark placed a hand firmly on the pulpit, steady and unyielding, reminding them that the truth, however painful, was a gift that spared David a lifetime of deception. And yet, just when the weight of Angela's secret seemed to have fully unraveled, and the community thought they had finally grasped the truth behind her lies, something new emerged. A detail overlooked at first began to surface, a clue that hinted the story was not yet complete. For Angela's deception was not only about a hidden marriage or financial betrayal. It was part of something larger, something deeper, something that no one in that room could have anticipated. If this was the first truth revealed, what devastating secret was still waiting to come to light? When the dust of the first revelations began to settle, many in the community still clung to the idea that perhaps Angela was a victim of her past, trapped by circumstance, cornered by decisions that spiraled beyond her control. But as the investigation pressed further, the illusion of innocence collapsed. Records uncovered by authorities painted a very different picture, one that turned sympathy into outrage. The second marriage, the forged papers, the hidden accounts, none of it was chance. Angela had not stumbled into deception. She had built it, piece by piece, like a careful architect of betrayal. Every false signature, every evasive answer, every carefully rehearsed smile was revealed for what it truly was, part of a deliberate scheme to manipulate those who trusted her most. The courtroom became the stage where every secret was dragged into the light. The forged documents were laid out before the judge, each signature examined, each lie unmasked. Witnesses spoke, bank clerks who remembered Angela withdrawing money under names that did not belong to her, neighbors who recalled late-night arguments behind closed doors, even the man she had been married to in secret, who described a life riddled with contradictions and silence. Each testimony was another blow, another reminder to David that the woman he had believed in, the woman he had loved, had never truly existed. The marriage he had longed for was not destroyed by chance, but by design. David sat in the courtroom, his face a mask of quiet devastation. Every revelation stripped away another piece of the future he had imagined. It was not only his wedding that had been stolen, it was his trust, his dignity, and the years he had invested believing in a love that was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. The weight of it all crushed him in silence, for there were no words strong enough to capture the magnitude of betrayal. The congregation, once divided, now stood united in their dismay. Those who had once defended Angela turned their eyes away in shame, unable to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the truth now laid bare. And through it all, Pastor Mark remained firm. He had not wanted this role, to be the one to halt a ceremony that was supposed to be filled with joy. Yet by choosing truth over tradition, he had spared David from a lifetime of living within a falsehood. His decision came at great cost. He had faced backlash, whispers, and criticism. But in the end, it was clear. His courage had protected the sanctity of marriage far more than silence ever could. Angela's fate was sealed not only by the law but by the eyes of the community she had deceived. When the gavel struck, the courtroom echoed with finality, and Angela, once radiant in her wedding gown, now left in shame, her head lowered, her future shattered by her own choices. She had entered that church as a bride ready to deceive again, but she walked out as a figure of disgrace, stripped of the illusions she had clung to. David remained behind, standing in the quiet emptiness of his ruined dreams. His suit no longer looked sharp. It hung on him like a weight he could not shake. He stared ahead, hollow-eyed, trying to reconcile the man he had been that morning with the man left standing now. Pastor Mark closed his Bible slowly, his hand steady, his heart heavy. In that silence, the true question emerged, one that lingered not only in David's mind, but in the minds of all who witnessed it. What is more sacred, protecting the tradition of ceremony or defending the truth even when it destroys what we hoped for? The church eventually emptied, yet the questions it left behind did not fade. For David, for Angela, for Pastor Mark, and for every soul who bore witness to that unforgettable day, the echoes of what transpired would linger far longer than the vows that were never spoken. And now, dear viewer, the question turns to you. If you had stood in Pastor Mark's shoes, what choice would you have made? Would you have spoken the truth, even if it meant shattering a sacred ceremony, exposing pain before a crowd, and rewriting the lives of everyone present? Or would you have remained silent, letting tradition carry forward, knowing deep within that deception stood at the altar? These are not easy questions, for they reach into the very heart of trust, honor, and courage. David lost more than a wedding that day. He lost the foundation he had built his hopes upon. Angela walked away not as a bride, but as a reminder that even the most carefully hidden secrets cannot remain buried forever. And Pastor Mark carried with him both the burden and the strength of knowing that truth, however painful, must always come before comfort. Their story is a mirror held up to us all, forcing us to ask where we stand when love and honesty collide. So, what would you have done if you were in Pastor Mark's place? Would you have stopped the wedding, or allowed silence to preserve the illusion of happiness? Let us know in the comments. We would truly love to hear your thoughts. Before we close, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. It is always a privilege to know the stories that reach across towns, across states, across the world, and connect us here in one moment. And most importantly, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. For what you have heard today is only one of many truths waiting to be uncovered. Long after the courthouse emptied and the church pews grew silent again, the story of David, Angela, and Pastor Mark remained etched in the minds of those who had witnessed it. What began as a day filled with anticipation and joy had unraveled into a lesson that stretched far beyond a single wedding. It was not just the collapse of a ceremony. It was the collapse of trust, the shattering of dignity, and the exposure of how fragile love becomes when built upon secrets. David had not only lost the woman he thought he knew, he had lost the comfort of believing that love could protect him from deception. For Angela, her choices were revealed not as mistakes, but as deliberate acts of betrayal, woven with intent and executed without thought for the hearts she would wound. And for Pastor Mark, the decision to speak truth at the altar would forever define him as a man who placed integrity above tradition, even when it cost him dearly. Trust is the thread that binds relationships, and once torn, it rarely mends the same way again. Betrayal is not just an act. It is a shadow that stretches over families, friendships, and communities, leaving scars that linger for years. In this story, Angela's deception did not end at the altar. It reached into every corner of David's family, casting doubt on what they had once believed about her, and forcing them to re-examine what it truly means to know someone. Friends questioned themselves, asking how they had missed the signs. Families whispered about the dangers of blind devotion. And the community itself found its unity tested, torn between sympathy and condemnation, between forgiveness and outrage. Faith, too, stood trial on that day. Marriage, in its truest form, is more than an exchange of vows. It is a covenant built on honesty, on the belief that two people can stand before God and man and declare themselves whole and true. Pastor Mark's choice to halt the ceremony was not only about Angela's lies, it was about defending the sacredness of that covenant. His words carried the weight of Scripture, but also the burden of responsibility. For he understood that silence in the face of deception would be as much a betrayal as the act itself. The Bible he held that day was more than a symbol. It was the anchor that gave him courage to speak when others might have faltered. And yet, the deeper question remains: what happens when love is intertwined with lies? David believed in Angela, devoted himself to her, and dreamed of a future together. But if that future was never real, what then was the love he felt? Was it love at all, or merely an illusion crafted by a woman skilled in hiding her truth? This is the haunting question that lingers long after the flowers have withered and the candles have burned out. Can love exist where deception thrives? Or is love without honesty nothing more than a fragile imitation, destined to collapse when the weight of truth finally breaks through? The story of David, Angela, and Pastor Mark is not just about one wedding. It is a mirror reflecting the dangers of trust misplaced, the power of truth revealed, and the choices that define us when faced with deception. It is about how lies do not merely wound individuals, they ripple outward, shattering families, communities, and faith itself. And it is about how one word, spoken with courage at the right moment, can change the course of lives forever. The wedding that began with joy ended with a single word: truth. A word that stripped away illusions, exposed betrayal, and left a man standing alone at an altar he once believed would mark the beginning of his future. A word that cast a woman from the pedestal of love to the shadows of disgrace. And a word that cemented the legacy of a pastor who valued integrity above comfort. So, we leave you with a final question, one that reaches beyond this story and into the heart of every relationship. If love is built on lies, was it ever love at all?